Okay, let's start without much ado. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Montek Singh Ahluwalia from St. Petersburg of late. Very kind of you, Montek, to join us. I'm very pleased that Arun Myra, Member Planning Commission, is also with us. This is something that we've been looking forward to at NCAER for quite some time. My colleagues, Shashank Bide and Puranchand Parida, are the key architects of the work we have done, and also the architects of this important workshop, at least important for us in a very big way. The work that we want to discuss today really stems from the work we did at Arun's behest for the 11th five-year plan, and then of course the scenario modeling for the 12th five-year plan, which was specifically Arun's assignment for us. This goes back, however, I would say almost to the second five-year plan, when NCER was still very new and a fledgling organization. But the Mahalanobis model was just coming into its own, and NCER provided a lot of the empirical grounding and the household surveys in the late 50s, I would say, and early 60s, that provided some of the backing for the hypotheses that were at that point being deployed to justify the work that was done under the second five-year plan. So it's a long history from the second to the 12th five-year plan, and I think it's an opportune moment for us to take stock on where we are. As you've seen from the program, ladies and gentlemen, there's a fairly comprehensive coverage of the issues, and we are expecting that we will have a very fruitful discussion with the special papers that have been provided by several of our collaborators for the discussion today. The key objective, as I see it, is for us to take stock. For NCER, this is very important work. It provides us the backdrop against which we do a lot of our other work, more sector-focused, more micro work. And this is where, of course, we feel very privileged at NCER to be doing both the macro and the micro. While I have said NCER several times, I should emphasize that we are certainly not the only ship in the sea. There are a large number of institutions that are also doing similar work, and we're very grateful that many of them will be here today. And of course, we interact with them very often. I should very specifically mention that the Planning Commission itself has been a key catalyst for this work. And for a long time now, we've had discussions in the Planning Commission where different institutions have come together, presented their work in an interactive and peer review process, which has, of course, strengthened all the components of that work. With that, and with Arun's permission, who is the resident chairman here at the workshop, I'm going to go to Montek in St. Petersburg and request him for his keynote address. Montek?
Thanks very much, Shekhar, and I'm delighted to be able to interact with you and with the seminar. I guess there are more people there than I can see, because I can only see the distinguished people around you on the table, but if there are other people, let me say hello to them all.
We'll keep that a secret from you, Montek.
Sorry?
No, that's fine. There are many other people besides what you see.
Now, I just wanted to say that first, I think the whole issue of the role of models in planning has been evolving over time. I mean, as you said, the original Mahalanobis model was really practically a back-of-the-envelope type of idea. I mean, it was less a model, more a characterization of what is very important. Then the Planning Commission moved into these very more detailed multi-sector input-output models. And while they were very detailed, they all suffered from the shortcomings of input-output models, which I think is quite well known. And I think there was also the problem that when you do models in-house, they become an internal black box. And there's less of a tendency to criticize them because they're your own model. So actually one of the important things we did in the 11th plan was to, in addition to the input-output model, which for the 11th plan did get used, we outsourced to about 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 research institutions model building for the Indian economy. Now these models were of very different variety. I mean, some were what you might call econometric macroeconomic models. Some were general equilibrium models, which I think is the one that you're looking at yourselves. There were others which were more like time series analyses, relatively little of internal causal relationships. And typically what the Planning Commission would do is it would pose a large number of general issues and options to the different model builders. They'd all come back with answers that were somewhat different, partly reflecting the fact that the models themselves were very different in structure, and then we would take a kind of a central view. And that's, I think, the only sensible way to use models. I mean, the idea of using a model as something that dictates the entire detail actually doesn't, in my view, make sense. So that was the first step. Second important step taken during the 12th plan, and this is largely or wholly really Arun's initiative, because he had a lot of experience in this, that instead of having a model that gives you a single preferred option, and then sort of writing up a plan around it, and then just assuming that that's what it is, what we ought to do is scenario analysis. Paint a number of different scenarios of the way the system could go, outline what's going to happen. And I think this can be done both in terms of quantitative models and also more generally in qualitative terms. And I think what was done here was the NCAER model, which was actually used for scenario analysis earlier in the context of the CII, got used to construct the sort of scenarios the Planning Commission wanted. Now we had a couple of meetings where the structure of the model was discussed. Our people identified things that they regarded as critical, which was fed back to the team. The team then restructured the model to build that into the model structure. And I think we have, as a result, a model structure that we are happy with, in the sense that we think it's rich enough to address some of these issues. Now, when I say rich enough, no model is ever going to capture all the details of the interactions and the feedback loops, etc., that occur. Almost all of these are, in some sense, simulated in a reduced form way, and therefore the extent of the feedback depends critically on some parameters, which are usually assumed. But I don't regard that as a criticism. I think I regard that more as an invitation to everybody to actually look at the model and see what's driving it, and to zero in on what actually matters. I mean, some people, for example, might get very interested in a particular parameter and may say, well, it really shouldn't be 0.83, I know it's 0.79, and if you feed that in, it may not make any difference whatsoever. On the other hand, what might matter is a whole lot of other critical assumptions, some of which are estimated, some of which are guesstimated, if you like. So I think that is a very important issue that in any model building, I mean, certainly the Planning Commission, as a user of this model, has to keep in mind. And I think the conference should very much keep that in mind. And what is more, the model building team and NCAER generally should keep it in mind. Now, from a policy point of view, this is the first time that the Planning Commission has actually resorted to scenario analysis. And actually, if you look at the scenario analysis, and in several contexts, the Prime Minister himself has referred to it, what it is telling us is really what should inform the public debate. And for example, there is a completely sterile public debate on growth versus inclusion. Whereas, obviously, these things are simultaneously determined. And what the model spells out is that the outcome depends very critically on the kinds of policies that are followed. I'm not saying that all the relevant richness of policy choices is correctly reflected, but that's part of the whole debate about model structure. But the end result is three scenarios came out in the trust plan. Three scenarios also come out of the modeling paper. The numbers are not exactly the same, but that's because these two things were refined at different times. As far as the trust plan is concerned, what we said was that there is a sort of first best, optimal, best assumptions kind of outcome. If we do everything that we think is necessary, most of which we've laid down, all of which actually we've laid down in the trust plan, then we thought that we could probably get what we call a strong inclusive growth outcome, which is a growth rate of GDP is averaging 8%. Actually, that's a very, very tough target to achieve, because the global economy for the second year round has not actually been in good shape. But that's not very important, because the 8%, I mean, if you slip it so that it begins from this year onwards and doesn't include the next year or something, you can probably still get 8%, or if you don't do that, you may get a little bit less. But that is the upper level achievement, which we believe will bring a lot of positives in terms of inclusiveness. There is obviously a middle level where you don't actually get to do everything, but you do get to do quite a lot. And the contribution that at least this kind of scenario thinking, which is embedded now in the plan, is that we say, well, instead of 8%, then you're talking of something between 6 and 6.5%. And we've gone further and said, look, let's not just assume that we'll either be very good or good. We could also be bad. And that's essentially what we call a policy logjam situation. Now, we have had, in the course of the last year or so, an exposure to very fractious political debates, and maybe an appearance that some policies it's not easy to get agreement on. Now, I don't put too much weight on this, in the sense we are, after all, a functioning democracy, and this is the last year before we go for a general election. And democratic government is both competitive and adversarial. I mean, it's not the case that in a democracy everybody sits around and says, although we don't like different political parties, we all agree that this is the right thing to do. So we're going to have a contentious period where perhaps not too much by way of reforms that require legislative support will be done. But on the other hand, there's a lot that needs to be done which is simply executive. That will also be criticized, but you're not held back from a legislative point of view. And if you take the whole agenda of the plan and assume that we should work very hard to build a consensus around those policies, and let's say an ideal arrangement would be that somewhere around the middle of the plan, most of this gets done, which really means the year 2014-15. So we're losing a little bit in the year 2013-14, but even there, in my view, quite a lot that doesn't require legal changes that happen. So if, on the other hand, we lose this time, and we're not able to make progress on critical policy decisions, then what the plan says is that the growth rate will drop to 5 and 5.5%. Now, I recall when planning models, etc., plan documents used to be discussed, I mean, people would invariably end up saying, oh, well, these plans are very good, but they're not implemented. Now, that's a bit nonsensical, in the sense that plans are about what you're going to do. So you should never be laying out plans based on assumptions that can't actually materialize. So what a scenario analysis is doing is it's actually telling you that, look, if not much happens in these critical areas, then please be satisfied with 5 and 5.5%. Actually, your model, the NCAER model, pitches it lower than that. I seem to remember 4.8 was the bottom line that you had. That again, those differences are not critical. What this thing says is the response to the policy space is something of the order of 3 percentage points of GDP. Now, remember that if population is growing at 1.5 percentage points of GDP, or 1.5 percentage points per year, then at 5%, what you've got is a per capita growth rate of 3.5, or if you do 8%, it's a per capita growth rate of 6.5%. So near doubling of the per capita growth rate is what is at stake. Now, if people think that it doesn't matter, well, I mean, then they're making a very conscious decision of the kind of future they want. What might be more interesting, of course, is that people might say that the policy choices we've got are wrong. In other words, they want the 8%, but they think they can get the 8% through a different mix of policy choices. And that is really what quantifying the scenarios enables you to do. I mean, quite frankly, in my view, NCAER should allow the Planning Commission to put its model onto our website so that anybody can manipulate. I mean, if it is really true that motivating people, just plain motivating people, and after all of us that run organizations, and everybody knows that, you know, what an organization does is the result of what the sum total of people in that organization do. Japanese are particularly good at this because they go for things like company songs and what have you to enthuse people in the morning. I mean, if people think we don't need any of this because productivity can be increased by 40% simply by singing collectively uplifting songs every morning, by all means let them state that very clearly. And you know, quite frankly, if they find it works, I mean, good luck to them. But I think it forces you to ask yourself, now, what are the policies we're talking about? I'm not saying they're all modeled in this, in the paper so far, but in the plan as a whole, I think clearly we're talking about India is dominantly a private sector economy. 75% of the investment is in the private sector. Now, people may or may not agree with that. I mean, agree with whether that's a good thing. But as long as 75% of the investment is in the private sector, whatever state you're running, you better ask yourself, are you giving the right set of incentives to the private sector of the state? I don't mean by the private sector, incidentally, the corporate sector alone. I mean farmers, I mean small businesses, I mean medium businesses, and of course the corporate sector. Taking them in total, are we doing a good thing? Now, that the plan focuses on, I mean, should focus on the role of investment and actually the role of, you know, the investment climate. I mean, Arun is involved in work that we're trying to encourage, which is to look at the ease of doing business in different states. I mean, wherever you go, internationally, that is the big thing that people actually talk about. And, you know, we don't come out well on that. I think somewhere we said that, you know, if you look at the ease of doing business measures, it's kind of interesting. There are, I forget how many, but the World Bank has a whole bunch of indicators on the basis of which they grade you, and then they take an average. And we come out, as I recall, on one of those exercises, we come out 167th out of 184 countries. You know, people get very upset because we have a very low rank in HDI. But actually our rank in ease of doing business is even lower. Not too many people bother about it, right? But it seems to me that if the ease of doing business is going to lead to the growth of small-scale enterprises, middle enterprises, employment-generating enterprises, if that's going to produce the kind of employment that people in rural areas can reasonably expect to acquire the skills in order to meet, and then all this inclusive growth has to require a big change. In fact, it's very clear in the first plan that performance in the manufacturing sector in India in the last in the 11th plan period is a clear disappointment. It was picking up, and that was good, but then it stays off again, and maybe due to the short-term crisis. But as of now, we don't see anywhere near getting to double-digit numbers. Now, when you look at the solutions for that, I mean, what are the solutions? Are they more subsidies, or is it getting to some of these basics? Now, how the model reflects that is something well worth thinking about. A couple of other things, because there are so many things in the plan that it's not really appropriate to list all of them. But I think it's extremely important to talk about what's happening to agricultural growth. The numbers don't necessarily add up to too much for GDP, but they do add up to a lot for income earning possibilities for people in rural areas. Now, I think there's a structural change taking place even there, because whereas earlier about 54% of the people were deriving their income from agriculture-oriented activity, now it's actually 50%, or a little less than 50%. And that's on a time disposition basis. I mean, it's not the percentage of income, it's the percentage of time. So since you think of agriculture as a residual activity, in all probability, these people are getting a larger percent of their income from non-agricultural activities. So there's a structural change. But what we need is definitely get to 4%, if not better, in terms of growth rate. And the good news there is that the 11th plan is showing an improvement. And I think some of the micro information coming out suggests that agriculture is doing better. There's far too much talk about agriculture being in a desperate situation, in a misery situation, and nothing happening. And quite frankly, I don't think this has any adequate basis. I'm not saying, by the way, that there aren't problems. There are problems. But the overall picture has to be that agriculture is showing a turnaround, manufacturing is not showing a turnaround. That is the bottom line. And the question is, does the model reflect that properly? What are the critical inputs? That's one set of issues. It's very important, obviously, for inclusiveness for two reasons. One is that agricultural growth will stimulate non-agricultural growth, which is actually not very capacity constrained. I mean, in the sense that if there's money coming out of agriculture, people will demand services, repair shops will come up, all kinds of non-agricultural activity in rural areas will take off. Second, very big issue, on which I think we've made some progress, but not nearly enough, is energy. And energy is an issue that is relevant in the context of what's happening globally. By and large, I mean, although the slowdown has softened the trend in oil prices, by and large, the assumption is that A, energy prices globally are going to be high, and B, that India is an energy deficient country in the sense that we are importing, and C, our domestic prices are much lower than international prices. I don't believe that the models can go into all these issues in sufficient detail. But it can sort of simulate different types of energy shocks and what is it that they're likely to do and what is the impact of different kinds of responses. So in my view, in terms of longer term modeling, modeling energy behavior and the nature of the energy constraint is absolutely critical. Actually, in the Planning Commission, we are separately doing an energy modeling exercise where we have some in-house, more like a calculator kind of capacity to add up a lot of things and make a lot of assumptions. But we are feeding out to a couple of research institutions the task of actually modeling what's going to happen in energy. Another area, and I'm not sure that can be handled in the model that we have at the moment, is water. There's absolutely no question that water is going to be a critical constraint, and how we manage it and how efficiently we handle it is really going to make a huge difference. Of course, one of the standard macroeconomic things that a model can do is to simulate the effect of fiscal constraints. How much do they allow in terms of transfers? How much should these resources be used to stimulate growth? And I think this is both politically very sensitive, it's very genuine. In the 12th plan, we have said that subsidies as a percent of GDP should come down from 2.3% to about 1.5%. I mean, there's a lot of focus in the public discussion on what this implies for food security. And I keep telling people that what it implies for food security is that if the food security bill and the food security program is the top priority, which it clearly is, then all of the, whatever subsidy space we have should be used by food security. But the other implication of that is that energy subsidies should be got rid of. Personally, I'm in favor of that. Not easy to do. If you can't do it immediately, maybe you can do it in a 1-2 year period. And that's a very interesting thing to simulate. I mean, many people, for reasons that I'm not very clear, believe that it should somehow be possible to keep energy prices low. And I've frequently explained to members of parliament that there's a little bit of a conundrum here. There's no doubt in my mind that if global energy prices would fall, that India would benefit in terms of a higher growth rate. From that, it doesn't follow that even though the global prices are high, India should lower energy prices. Because that will have a lot of negative effects via either the subsidy or the ability of energy companies to reinvest, or the incentive of people to come in and invest. And you know, right now, we have a controversy on virtually every aspect of energy pricing. I mean, we know that coal is short. One of the great successes of the last 2 years is that generation capacity has expanded at rates that we've never seen before. And this is largely because half of it is from the private sector. But coal supply and gas supply haven't expanded. So we have to become dependent on imported coal and imported gas. But imported gas comes in at about 4 times the domestic price, and imported coal comes in at close to twice the domestic price. So, you know, what do? I think these are actually issues which, if you just pose them sectorally, it becomes like economics 101. But put them all together in a model and ask yourself, do you really want the subsidies to go up to 3%? Nothing wrong with saying so, but then feed that through the model and see what happens. And if it turns out that your growth rate is going to be 5%, are you quite happy with that? Or you prefer to do something else? Now, I think that is what scenario analysis should enable us to do. And I mean, what is being outlined at the moment is sort of using the model to, as it were, chart the planning commission scenarios, kind of scenarios made to order. But a really effective modeling exercise should enable one to chart out any scenarios. And it could well be that you chart out scenarios quite different from the ones that are laid out in plan. So that's a bit of a rambling account of why I think this work is important. I'm delighted that NCAER is projecting this work now, not simply as an input into the 12th plan, but as a bit of research which hopefully will grow and develop its own momentum. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there. I see that Arun is representing Planning Commission, and so he will give you all the feedback that you need. But you know, we have been very strongly in favor of projecting this kind of work in the public. And I think one of the great advantages of the scenario type of approach is that it doesn't set up a single target. I mean, if you get up and say India is going to grow at 8%, there are innumerable people who get up and say, no, it's not going to grow at 8%. So I think you're really telling them, okay, tell us what you think is feasible, and we'll tell you what will happen, and you tell us if you're happy about it. I think that's very helpful. Thank you, NCAER, thank you, Shekhar, thank you, Mr. Bide, and all your team for having done this work, and I do hope that you have a successful conference. Thanks.